This is part 2 of the concise and complete history of England and Britain. If you missed part 1, watch it now. In 1679, the issue of Charles's heir and brother James being Catholic sparked the exclusion crisis over whether he should be allowed to succeed. This led to the creation of the first political parties, the pro-exclusion Whig Party and the anti-exclusion Tory Party. Charles died in 1685 and was succeeded by James II. He ruled with Tory support but forced unpopular policies to restore Catholicism. In 1688, the elites turned on the king and replaced him with the grandson of Charles I, William III. This event, known as the Glorious Revolution, led to the creation of the Bill of Rights, an act of parliament that limits the powers of the monarch, sets rights for elections, human rights, freedom of speech, and other fundamental constitutional laws, and it is still in effect today. 1688 also saw the start of the 9 Years' War. This conflict was between France and a grand alliance of England, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the Dutch Republic and Savoy, and is sometimes considered the first global war, as it was fought in North America, India and mainland Europe. This conflict took a toll on the Dutch due to the costly land war and left England the stronger colonial power. In 1701, England, Portugal and the Netherlands sided with the Holy Roman Empire against France and Spain in the War of Spanish Succession. The conflict lasted until 1714, with France and Spain losing. The many outcomes of the war created favourable conditions for England. The Peace of Utrecht Treaty prevented the same person becoming king of both France and Spain. All participants were left with high levels of debt, and only England could successfully finance it. England also established naval superiority over its rivals, gained strategic ports such as Gibraltar, overseas territories such as Newfoundland, and commercial access to Spanish America. The Dutch were effectively bankrupt, and the damage done to their merchant navy permanently affected their commercial and political strength. During these events in 1707, the Act of Union took place, the joining of England and Scotland into a singular nation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Scotland found itself destitute after a failed attempt to set up an overseas colony of its own, and despite protest, the treaty was ratified by both parliaments which then combined. Queen Anne thus became the first occupant of the British throne. By 1720, Britain was one of the most prosperous nations in the world. While other colonial powers were motivated by territorial gain or protection of their dynasties, Britain had a different set of interests. Its main goal was building a worldwide trade network for merchants, manufacturers, shippers and financiers. This would require a Royal Navy so powerful that no rival could sweep its ships from the world's trade routes or threaten the British Isles. The government incorporated numerous privately funded London-based companies to set up trade enterprises, and each was given a monopoly in a specific region. These companies include the Hudson Bay Company and the East India Company. Britain dominated trade in India, West Africa and the West Indies in commodities such as sugar, salt, spices, silk, tea, opium and slaves. In 1756, the 7 Years' War erupted, with all the major European nations participating and conflict taking place around the globe. France and Austria joined forces with Russia and Sweden in an attempt to curtail the rising British power. Britain allied itself with Prussia and Portugal. Britain emerged victorious and gained control of the French colonies in America. French power in India was effectively destroyed, leaving it free for the British. However, Britain found itself near bankruptcy after the war. In order to raise funds, they levied taxes on the 13 colonies of America. This led to the American War of Independence. Britain found itself with no allies, as the other European powers saw them as a threat, and America won its freedom in 1783. With the loss of its most populous colony, Britain shifted its focus to Asia, the Pacific, and Africa. Despite losing America, the growth of trade between Britain and the new United States compensated them economically, and Britain continued to grow its influence in India and settled Australia in 1788. The Industrial Revolution started in Britain in the mid-18th century and marks a major turning point in history in which almost every aspect of daily life was influenced. Britain was the beating heart of this paradigm shift, and its manufacturing power contributed even more to its success. By the late 1700s, Napoleon's rise to power in France was a direct threat to British dominance, and Britain invested huge amounts of resources to win. Napoleon's plans to invade Britain failed due to his inferior navy, and a decisive victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 left Britain as the principal naval and imperial power. This led to Pax Britannia, or British peace, a period of relative peace in the world for around 100 years, during which Britain adopted the role of global police. Following the Napoleonic Wars, British society changed and moved to be more urban and less rural. King George IV played less of a role in government, letting his ministers take full charge, and many reforms took place during the 19th century to transform Britain. By 1820, much of India had been subdued or annexed by the East India Company, and Britain expanded in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Between 1700 and 1850, Britain was involved in 137 wars or rebellions. Aside from the American War of Independence, it was largely successful in war, and crucially, financing it. While rivals France and Spain went bankrupt, Britain managed to maintain a large and expensive Royal Navy. It shifted the bulk of its income from estates to taxation on trade, and in 1790 income tax. This is how the British Empire was able to become the largest empire in the history of the world, the first superpower, and the empire on which the sun never sets. The Victorian era between 1837 and 1901 signified the height of the British Empire and saw the introduction of steamships, railways, photography, and the telegram. Britain and France fought and defeated Russia in the Crimean War in 1853, and Britain defeated Dutch settlers in the Boer War in South Africa in 1899. By the start of the 20th century, Germany and America had begun to challenge Britain's economic lead. Tensions between Britain and Germany partly led to World War I. Nearly 1 million Britons died between 1914 and 1918. While Britain emerged victorious, and with its largest territorial extent, it was no longer the leading economic or military power. Its dominions of Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa ended the war with much more independence than they had started it. Ireland became a free state in 1922, and Japan and America rose as naval powers, and Britain allied closer with America. During this time there was much fear about the security and future of the empire. In 1939, the British Empire had control of 25% of the world's population and 30% of its landmass. But as Nazi Germany grew its strength in the 30s, Britain initially sought peace under Neville Chamberlain, fearing another war. Eventually Chamberlain was replaced by Churchill, and following Germany's invasion of Poland, Britain again declared war. Technology had progressed greatly, and Britain found itself under bombardment from German planes. For the first time, civilians found themselves embroiled in the conflict, and London suffered nightly bombing. Over 1 million buildings were destroyed during the Blitz. An invasion of England was prevented by the Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain during 1940, the first major campaign solely fought by air forces. Hitler had planned a seaborne invasion once air superiority was achieved, but it was the British who achieved victory and survived to continue the war. Many of Britain's territories in Asia were occupied by Japanese forces, further damaging the prestige of the empire. Eventually the war was won, but it was clear that Britain was no longer the greatest power, having been overtaken by America. Britain was bankrupt and had to loan money from the US. India and most of the British territories gained independence in the global movement of decolonisation. Britain adopted a policy of peaceful disengagement with its colonies, as opposed to the other nations, which fought costly wars to try and maintain their territory. Between 1945 and 1965, the number of people under British rule outside the UK fell from 700 million to just 5 million. After independence, many former colonies joined the Commonwealth of Nations, a free association of independent states which also maintained the British monarch as their head of state. The Cold War would then come to dominate British policy for the next 40 years. In 1952, Queen Elizabeth II took the throne, and in 1973, Britain joined the European Union. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher became the first female Prime Minister and implemented many economic reforms which diminished union power and privatised many public services. This made her unpopular, but in 1983, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, claiming their right to the territory. Thatcher sent in British forces and retook them, increasing her popularity and restoring British pride. And in 1997, the last major overseas territory, Hong Kong, was handed over to China, and many see this as the final end of the British Empire. Today, Britain maintains sovereignty over 14 territories outside the British Isles, and is responsible for the spread of English language and culture throughout the world.